Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and in today's video we're going to be talking about our beautiful neighbor Mars and its two relatively small moons called Phobos and Deimos. You'll find out what a new theory suggests about how they were actually formed. Welcome to What the Math. Today we know that our beautiful neighbor Mars has two tiny moons. One is called Phobos and one is called Deimos. And these two moons were named after the feeling that you experience in war, which of course is what Mars is. It's the god of war. Phobos is fear and Deimos is it's the desire to flee, to run away. And essentially these two particular moons, first of all, they actually, like if you look at them, they actually have a relatively circular orbit. They orbit along the axis of Martian rotation, very similar to how Moon rotates around Earth as well. So our own satellite, our own Moon, rotates in a very similar fashion, although slightly, or I guess quite farther away than Phobos and Deimos from Mars. On the other hand, neither Venus nor Mercury have any satellites. As a matter of fact, we were very surprised to find out that only Mars and Earth seem to have moons in general. So there's something going on there, and the other thing that's going on here is, of course, the fact that we don't really know where Phobos and Deimos came from, but the prevalent theory today is that these two were actually captured asteroids, and this sort of explains why they're so small and why they're so asteroid-looking. But here is the problem with that theory, and here's what this new paper that I'm going to talk about today tries to, I guess, explain and disprove. First of all, if it's an asteroid, it shouldn't really have such a perfectly circular orbit along the axis of rotation. It just doesn't really make sense that it would be able to achieve such an orbit. And here we would have two asteroids that would achieve such an orbit, and it just chances of this are very, very, very low. Secondly, today the most prevalent theory about the formation of our moon is that it was created when an object that was about size of Mars collided with early Earth, and then the material from the surface of that collision sort of escaped, started orbiting around Earth, and created our moon. And I've talked about this in two different videos. You can actually check them out on this channel where I explain in more detail how our moon was created. But here's the thing though, and this is actually what scientists from, I believe this was a Royal Observatory of Belgium, wrote about. And this is an article they posted in Nature magazine in 2016. And here I think the main investigator was Pascal Rosenblatt. And he basically talks about how, well, doesn't it make sense that Martian moons were formed in a very similar way, especially since they actually have very similar orbital parameters? And this of course would explain why neither Mercury nor Venus have any moons, because they never received a collision. In other words, what they're suggesting is that there was a very massive collision that Mars had sometime in its historical past that essentially threw off a bunch of material that started orbiting around Mars and then eventually created the moons. Now let's actually recreate this from scratch. Let's see if I can actually help you visualize this. So what they're saying is this. And of course we don't really know what date it is, we don't really know when exactly this happened, but this also could have happened when Mars was still habitable and beautiful and had water and stuff. So sometime in the past, something the size of a dwarf planet and something that wasn't too large but also wasn't too small, and I'm going to refer to it as a Martian collider, essentially decided to approach Mars and did that. Now, we know that on the surface of Mars, specifically in the northern region, which is sort of right here, there is a very, very large crater-looking formation. Maybe this is actually what created this. And look at that. See how there's actually particles orbiting around Mars already? Now, what this essentially did is this. It created a kind of a ring, essentially, a particle ring that started orbiting around Mars, relatively close to it actually. And as these particles orbited around one another, the ones that were closer to Mars started to accrete a lot faster than the ones that were farther away, and then the ones that were very, very close to Mars basically started to create a kind of a moon around the planet. And so the particles that were closer to Mars created this larger kind of a moon that started orbiting relatively close to the surface of Mars. And as you can see, because it was sort of more massive than other objects, it started to kind of influence the rest of the particles in this particular ring. And then this object also influenced the creation of other smaller moons on the outskirts. As a matter of fact, it sort of pushed some of these particles closer together, and this is essentially how both Phobos and Deimos were born. So this larger moon right here helped them to essentially coalesce into the objects that we know them today. So if I look at this, if I accelerate time, you'll notice how this larger moon starts to disrupt this ring that was actually almost perfectly pancake-like, but now it sort of creates these really interesting shapes that will actually have some particles move closer together, obviously collide with one another, and create other larger rocks. So if I just show you what happens with time here, you'll see how this larger moon influences these particles. And so, with time, after about 5 million years or so after the collision, Mars has acquired another 2 satellites. So there we had Phobos and Deimos. And there they are on the outskirts. You can kind of sort of see them. They're orbiting around Mars as well. And this was, of course, created by this larger moon. After several million years, obviously all of these other particles have already disappeared and or collided back with Mars, or possibly escaped into the outer solar system. So essentially what we had here is this. We had 3 moons orbiting and nothing else. Now what exactly happened to this larger moon then? Where is it? Well, here's the interesting thing. If an object orbits relatively close to Mars because of its structure, it will eventually get attracted to it and essentially collide with it. This is exactly what's happening to Phobos. We know that Phobos one day will fall onto Mars. Well, first it will actually disintegrate into little particles because of something called Roche limit, and then it will collide with Mars and disappear. And this is probably what happened to this larger moon somewhere after about 5 to 6 million years after the collision. It essentially came closer and closer and closer to Mars until at some point it basically disappeared somewhere on the surface and collided with Mars as well, possibly leaving another crater on the surface. And then we had nothing left except for Phobos and Deimos. Now, this is actually a pretty interesting theory. I believe it actually possibly is the best theory we have today that explains both the fact that Mars has a very large crater-like structure on its surface, and of course the fact that its moons seem to have a circular orbit and orbit in a very, very peculiar way, like a normal moon would if it was formed at the same time as the planet, or if it was somehow created from a collision similar to our moon. But the only way we'll know if this is actually a fact, and the only way we'll find out if this is true, is when one of the ESA, European Space Agency missions, actually decides to finally visit Phobos and Deimos, or possibly the Chinese Space Agency that also had a plan for it, and then obviously gathers samples and studies them and compares them to the samples collected from Mars. This is actually probably the only and the main way we can finally prove where Phobos and Deimos came from. And this is of course how we were able to also show that our own moon has very similar composition to the rocks on Earth, which is how we've come up with a theory to explain that our moon was formed from a collision and is basically made out of the same stuff as our planet Earth. So whether Phobos and Deimos are made of the same stuff as Mars, we'll find out hopefully sometime in 2020s when either ESA, European Space Agency, or CSA, Chinese Space Agency, decide to come to Mars and collect some of the samples here. But all in all, to be honest, I think this is actually one of the best theories we have today that explains quite well where Phobos and Deimos came from, explains the fact that Mars has a very large crater, and of course may also suggest how Mars actually lost its atmosphere and water. Maybe, just maybe, it was all because of a very, very, very large collision that may have actually helped it lose all of the stuff on the surface, including the water and atmosphere. For all we know, that's actually what happened, and hopefully one day we'll find out. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, don't forget to subscribe, don't forget to share this video with your friends, and don't forget to like this if you actually enjoyed watching it. And in the next video, we'll talk about something else, space, math, or science related. We'll possibly do some video gaming, and hopefully you'll learn something from those videos as well. And in the meanwhile, let's actually do some more collisioning with Mars because they look so beautiful in this video game. Anyway, thank you for watching everyone, I'll see you in the next video, game you later, and as always, bye bye.